It began on a quiet stretch of the Kentucky frontier around the year 1840. A boy named William T. Anderson was born into a world of dust, horses, and hard work. No one looking at that young boy could have imagined the monster he would one day become. No one could have guessed that this same child, shy, quiet, polite, would grow into the man people would whisper about for generations. The man they called Bloody Bill. William's childhood was like that of many frontier boys. He lived with his parents, William C. Anderson and Martha Anderson, and his siblings in a small wooden house surrounded by farmland. The days were long and full of work. The Anderson family raised horses and made a living by trading them across the rough roads of Kentucky and Missouri. It wasn't an easy life, but it was an honest one. The frontier was wild, filled with danger, bandits, and lawlessness, but also full of opportunity. The Andersons worked hard, believed in family, and dreamed of a better life. When William was a young man, his father moved the family to Huntsville, Missouri. It was there, in the rolling hills and muddy roads of Missouri, that his destiny began to change. Missouri was a land divided. By the late 1850s, America was tearing itself apart. The North and South were fighting over slavery, power, and pride. And Missouri, sitting right between both worlds, became a battleground long before the Civil War ever began. Families split in half. Neighbors became enemies, and violence was no longer just a rumor. It was at everyone's door. For a young man like William, life on the frontier became more dangerous each year. He learned how to ride fast, how to shoot straight, and how to stay alive when things went bad. But no amount of skill could prepare him for the storm that was coming. In 1861, the Civil War officially began. Missouri was caught in the middle, a slave state that stayed with the Union, but filled with people who secretly supported the South. The state turned into chaos, and out of that chaos came something darker, a new kind of warfare. It wasn't soldiers fighting on open battlefields. It was neighbors ambushing neighbors. It was families murdered in the night. It was guerrilla war, and William Anderson was about to become one of its most feared fighters. At first, Anderson wasn't looking for war. He worked with his father, trading horses, trying to keep life steady. But one terrible day, tragedy struck. His father was shot and killed by a man he had argued with, reportedly a Union supporter. The young William was furious. He swore revenge. And that oath, that burning fire of anger, would follow him for the rest of his life. He hunted down his father's killer. According to local stories, William shot him dead without hesitation. And once he took that first life, something inside him changed forever. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. When the war spread through Missouri, Anderson joined a band of pro-Confederate guerrillas, part soldiers, part outlaws, led by William Quantrill, one of the most notorious fighters of the era. Quantrill's men were not regular soldiers. They were bushwhackers, fast-moving riders who struck from the shadows. They raided Union camps, ambushed patrols, and vanished before the enemy could react. To some, they were heroes defending their homes. To others, they were murderers and bandits, and William Anderson fit right in. He was quiet but fierce, young but fearless. He rode hard, shot fast, and never hesitated to kill. Even among the ruthless men of Quantrill's raiders, Anderson's coldness stood out. They said he rarely smiled, that his eyes were calm even in the middle of slaughter, and that he seemed to enjoy the sound of gunfire. As the months passed, Anderson's name began to spread. Union soldiers whispered it among themselves. Civilians fled when they heard he was near, but at this point he was still just William Anderson, a dangerous man, not yet the bloody legend he would become. The war had changed him, hardened him, but it hadn't yet broken him. That would come soon. In 1863, Anderson's world collapsed in a way that even he couldn't have imagined. Union forces captured several women suspected of helping the guerrillas. Among them were Anderson's sisters. They were locked inside a makeshift prison in Kansas City, a crumbling building that wasn't meant to hold people for long. Then one day the building collapsed. One of Anderson's sisters was killed, another was left permanently crippled, and William believed it wasn't an accident. He believed the Union soldiers had done it on purpose. That belief, true or not, lit a fire of vengeance inside him that would never go out. After that day, William Anderson was no longer the same man. He left behind any thought of rules, mercy, or restraint. He gathered his own band of riders, men who had also lost family to the war, and swore they would make the North pay. They rode under black flags. They showed no mercy, and they made sure that every town they passed through would remember their names in terror. From that moment forward, William T. Anderson was gone. In his place rode a man of vengeance, a ghost of war, a man they would soon call Bloody Bill. The war had turned Missouri into a land of ghosts. Every field, every road, every small town carried the smell of smoke and gunpowder. It was 1863, the heart of the Civil War, and no place in America was more divided, more bloody, or more lawless than Missouri. And in the middle of that chaos rode a man whose heart had turned to stone. His name was William T. Anderson, but the people were beginning to whisper another name. They called him Bloody Bill. After the death of his sister in the Kansas City prison collapse, something inside Anderson snapped. He no longer cared about victory or politics. He didn't fight for the Confederacy or for any cause. He fought for one thing: revenge. He rode out from the shadows with a small band of men. They were outcasts, outlaws, broken souls, men who had lost their families, their homes, their reason to hope. But under Anderson's leadership they found something else, a purpose. A dark one. They called themselves bushwhackers, Confederate guerrillas who struck fast and vanished into the woods. Their enemies called them devils on horseback. Anderson's men rode lean horses, their guns polished and ready. They didn't wear uniforms, only dark clothes, wide hats, and pistols on both hips. They carried Colt revolvers, not rifles, because close-range killing was their art. They would ambush a Union patrol on a dirt road, gun down every man, take their supplies, and melt into the forest before the sound of the last shot had faded. To them, there were no rules, no mercy, no surrender, no prisoners. It was kill or be killed, and Anderson made sure it was never his side that fell first. Anderson's group began small, barely a dozen men. But each raid drew new recruits, men who admired his courage, men who feared him, men who wanted revenge just like him. Anderson was a natural leader, calm in battle, deadly under pressure. He didn't shout orders. He simply gave a look, and his men understood. They trusted him because he always rode at the front, never behind. But what made Anderson truly dangerous wasn't just his leadership. It was his coldness, his ability to kill without hesitation, without emotion, without regret. To him, vengeance had become a religion, and death was its only prayer. By late 1863, Missouri had become a living nightmare. Anderson and other guerrilla leaders, like William Quantrill and Little Archie Clement, launched one ambush after another. They raided Union camps, looted trains, and burned towns that supported the North. Union soldiers called them butchers, and civilians lived in constant fear. Even Confederate officers hesitated to work with them. These bushwhackers fought for their own reasons, personal, brutal, and bloody, and Anderson was quickly becoming the most feared of them all. One raid in particular spread his name across the state. It happened near Lawrence, Kansas, in August 1863. Quantrill led over 400 guerrillas, including Anderson, on an attack against the town, which was known for its strong Union loyalty. At dawn, they rode in. The sky glowed orange as fires consumed buildings and homes. Men were shot in the streets. Women screamed. By the time it ended, more than 150 men and boys lay dead. It became known as the Lawrence Massacre, one of the bloodiest civilian attacks of the war. Though Quantrill commanded the raid, Anderson's savagery stood out. Witnesses said he killed with frightening calm, even smiled while reloading his revolvers. From that day, Bloody Bill wasn't just a nickname. It was a warning. The Union Army responded with fury. They declared total war on the bushwhackers. Soldiers burned farms, arrested families, and executed suspected guerrilla supporters. But this only made Anderson stronger. Each raid, each reprisal, each act of vengeance fed his hatred even more. To him, every Union soldier was guilty. Every flag with stars and stripes was the enemy. And now, he began to make his revenge personal. He started hunting down Union sympathizers by name. If a man had helped the enemy, or if Anderson thought he had, his house would burn before morning. And if that man resisted, he would never see the sunrise again. Some said Anderson carried a list of names, men who had betrayed his family, soldiers who had been in Kansas City when his sister died. He crossed them out one by one, but his fury didn't stop there. He began to take trophies from his victims, rings, pistols, even scalps. His men began to wear Union uniforms taken from the dead, both as disguise and mockery. When they rode into battle, it was sometimes impossible to tell friend from foe until it was too late, and that was exactly how Anderson liked it. By 1864, Anderson had turned revenge into art. His raids became faster, deadlier, and more unpredictable. He attacked trains, supply lines, and patrols with shocking precision. He was a master of ambush, a ghost of the woods, striking and vanishing before anyone could react. Union soldiers began to tell stories about him, that he could appear out of the trees without a sound, that his horse never tired, that bullets couldn't kill him. They called him the Devil of Missouri, and perhaps in his mind, that wasn't far from the truth. But behind the violence, behind the rage, there was something else, something human. Those who rode with Anderson said he had moments of quiet. He spoke softly. He wrote letters home to his mother. Sometimes after a battle, he sat alone, staring into the fire, as if haunted by something only he could see. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the ghosts of the people he had lost. Or maybe it was the realization that he had gone too far to ever come back. Whatever it was, it didn't stop him. If anything, it made him even more dangerous. And as the summer of 1864 began to burn hotter, Bloody Bill Anderson was preparing for the act that would make him infamous forever, the massacre that would stain his name in history and shock even his fellow guerrillas. It would happen on a quiet September morning, when a single train stopped in a small Missouri town called Centralia, and by the time the smoke cleared, the world would never forget his name. By the fall of 1864, the Civil War was reaching its final, desperate stage. But in Missouri, the war wasn't just being fought on battlefields. It was being fought on dirt roads in small towns and in the hearts of men who had long forgotten mercy. And no man embodied that chaos more than William T. Bloody Bill Anderson. The name alone brought fear. To the Union Army, he was a ghost in gray, the kind of man who could ride out of the trees, kill a dozen soldiers, and vanish before the echoes faded. To civilians, he was a nightmare whispered at night, proof that the war had created monsters. Anderson had grown bolder, more unpredictable, and more dangerous than ever before. His men, hardened guerrillas and young followers alike, looked up to him as if he were untouchable. They rode under a black flag, a simple but chilling symbol: no mercy, no surrender. It was late September 1864 when Anderson's band of nearly 80 guerrillas rode into Centralia, Missouri, a quiet railroad town that had seen little of the war's worst violence. The people there didn't know it yet, but by the end of that day, their town would be burned into the pages of history and blood. They came thundering in on horseback, young, wild, and hungry for chaos. Some wore Union uniforms taken from the dead. Others wore parts of Confederate gray, but all of them carried pistols, knives, and hatred. They laughed as they entered town, firing shots into the air. To them, Centralia was just another target, a place to raid, to take what they wanted, and to leave behind a message of terror. They began looting stores, stealing horses, and drinking whiskey from the shelves. The townspeople watched helplessly as Anderson's men spread through the streets like a storm, and then came the sound that would change everything. The sharp, metallic whistle of a train pulling into the station. The train carried Union soldiers, 22 of them, all unarmed and off duty, heading home on leave. They didn't expect trouble, but when the train stopped, they saw the smoke, the riders, the black flags, and by then, it was too late. Anderson's men swarmed the train, guns drawn. The soldiers were forced off, lined up along the dirt road, their blue coats shining in the sunlight. They tried to explain that they weren't fighting, that they had no weapons. But Anderson didn't care. He rode up slowly, his eyes cold, his face unreadable. He asked one simple question: "Which of you are officers?" A few soldiers stepped forward, maybe thinking it would save the others. Anderson nodded. Then he smiled, a smile that made even his own men uneasy. Moments later, the first shots rang out. It was not a battle. It was an execution. Anderson's men fired their pistols again and again, walking down the line as bodies fell. The unarmed soldiers had no chance. When the smoke cleared, 22 men lay dead, shot at point-blank range. Some say Anderson ordered them stripped before they died, their clothes taken as trophies. Others say he did it as punishment and to humiliate the enemy. But all who saw it agreed on one thing: it was pure vengeance. As the townspeople buried their faces and prayed, Anderson's men set fire to the train and the station. They laughed, shouting that this was justice for Missouri, justice for the families who had died, justice for the women killed in Kansas City, justice for every wound the war had given them. But there was no justice that day. Only slaughter. Word of the massacre spread like wildfire. A nearby Union regiment, about 120 soldiers under Major A.V.E. Johnson, heard what had happened and rode out in pursuit. They wanted revenge, but Anderson knew they were coming. He set an ambush just outside Centralia, in a patch of tall grass and timber. His men hid among the trees waiting. The Union troops rode straight into the trap, and in minutes, it was over. Anderson's guerrillas surrounded them, firing from every direction. Pistols cracked, horses screamed, and men fell one after another. The Union line collapsed almost instantly. When the gunfire stopped, only a handful of soldiers survived. The rest, more than 100 men, were dead. Ground around Centralia was soaked in blood. That day became known as the Centralia Massacre, one of the most shocking events of the entire Civil War. Even hardened soldiers could hardly believe what they heard. It wasn't just a skirmish. It was the slaughter of men who couldn't defend themselves. Union newspapers called Anderson a demon, a butcher, a madman. Even some Confederate leaders were horrified, afraid his actions would destroy their cause. But to Anderson's men, he was a hero, the man who had struck fear into the enemy's heart like no one else could. They rode away from Centralia proud, wild, and undefeated. But deep inside, something in Anderson had changed again. He had crossed every line a man could cross, and once again there was no going back. In the days after Centralia, Anderson's face appeared on wanted posters across Missouri. The Union Army placed a bounty on his head, dead or alive. But catching him was another story. He moved like smoke, vanishing into the woods and fields, always one step ahead. He seemed untouchable, invincible. But history has a way of catching even the fastest riders, and Bloody Bill's luck was running out. He didn't know it yet, but the massacre that made him famous would also seal his fate. The Union Army wasn't just hunting him anymore. They were hunting him personally, and soon, one man, Major Samuel P. Cox, would set the perfect trap. The war for Missouri was ending. But for Bloody Bill Anderson, the end would come not in glory, but in the flash of gunfire on a quiet morning not far from the town of Orick, Missouri. By October 1864, the war in Missouri was reaching its boiling point. The Union Army had grown tired of chasing ghosts, tired of ambushes, burned towns, and mutilated soldiers. And at the top of their most wanted list was one name: Bloody Bill Anderson. For more than a year, Anderson had been the shadow of Missouri, striking, killing, and disappearing. He and his men had slaughtered soldiers at Centralia, wiped out patrols, and terrorized entire regions. His legend had become larger than life. Some said he could not die. Others believed the devil himself rode beside him. But legends have a way of blinding men, and Anderson had begun to believe his own. After the Centralia Massacre, he moved west with his band of guerrillas, around 80 men, each one armed to the teeth, their horses covered with plundered saddles, their pockets full of gold and blood-stained money. They rode through Ray County, burning, looting, and killing. They were drunk on power and fury. Anderson rode at their head, his long dark hair flowing behind him, 2 revolvers in each hand, and a necklace made of Union soldiers' scalps hanging around his neck. He wore it proudly, a symbol of terror. To his men, he was untouchable. To his enemies, he was unstoppable, but to fate, he was already marked. Not far away, a man named Major Samuel P. Cox was preparing for him. Cox commanded a small detachment of Union cavalry, tough, battle-hardened men who had seen too many raids, too many burned farms, too many dead friends. They had one mission now: find Bloody Bill and end him. The Union Army knew Anderson's patterns. He liked to move fast, to hit, run, and vanish. But lately something had changed. He'd become bolder, slower, almost reckless. He thought no one could touch him. and that overconfidence would soon be his undoing. On the morning of October 26, 1864, Anderson and his men rode near the small town of Orick, Missouri. The sun was low, the fields quiet, the autumn air heavy with the smell of smoke from distant fires. They didn't know it, but Major Cox and his men were already waiting. The ambush was set. Cox had hidden his soldiers behind a line of brush and trees along the road, perfectly still, their rifles aimed, their fingers ready. They had scouted Anderson's path for days. They knew he would come through this very road. Now, they only had to wait for the devil himself to ride into the trap. Anderson's band approached slowly at first. They were laughing, shouting, confident, the way men sound when they think the world fears them. And then, as they reached a small clearing, the woods exploded with gunfire. Cox's men opened fire with everything they had, rifles, pistols, and carbines, the sound rolling across the field like thunder. The guerrillas were caught completely off guard. Horses screamed, men fell. And Anderson, realizing what had happened, shouted for his men to charge. He didn't retreat. He never did. He spurred his horse forward and galloped straight into the gunfire, his revolvers blazing. Bullets ripped through the air around him. One struck his horse, throwing it down. Anderson leapt to his feet and kept firing. Witnesses said he fought like a wild animal, fearless, furious, unstoppable. But no man, not even Bloody Bill, could outrun fate. A single bullet struck him in the head, just above the eye. He dropped instantly, his body falling hard into the dirt. The man who had terrified Missouri for years was dead before he hit the ground. The gunfire slowed. Smoke drifted over the field. When it cleared, the Union soldiers advanced carefully. There, lying motionless in the mud, was the body of William T. Anderson, the man they had hunted for so long. Cox himself approached, staring down at the young man who had caused so much death. And he couldn't believe it. Bloody Bill was only 24 years old. He looked more like a boy than a monster. His face pale, his hair tangled with dust and blood. His revolvers still hung at his sides. One of them had his initials carved into the handle. For a moment, even the soldiers stood in silence. The war had taken countless lives, but this one felt different. It was the death of a legend. They carried his body to Richmond, Missouri, and laid it out for the world to see. A photographer took pictures, grainy black and white images that would spread across the country. People crowded around to look at the face of the man who had haunted Missouri. Some spat on him. Some prayed over him, and a few whispered that even dead, he didn't look human. The Union soldiers displayed his weapons, his black flag, and even the necklace of scalps, proof of who he had been and what he had done. That night, they buried him in an unmarked grave on the edge of town. No ceremony, no name, just a hole in the earth for a man who had lived and died by violence. But death couldn't erase his story. It couldn't erase the fear or the legend. Within weeks, the tale of Bloody Bill Anderson spread across the country. Some called him a murderer, others a soldier of vengeance. To many in the South, he became a symbol of rebellion, a man who refused to bow, even in death. And to others, he was proof that war can twist good men into monsters. Anderson's followers scattered after his death. But one of them, a young outlaw named Jesse James, carried his legacy forward. He would take Anderson's ruthless methods and bring them into a new era, the era of the wild. West, the ghost of Bloody Bill would live on through men like him, men who believed the gun was the only law left in America, and so ended the life of William T. Bloody Bill Anderson, a man who rode out of Kentucky with nothing but a horse and a dream, and became one of the most feared killers in American history. A man who sought revenge and found only destruction. A man who showed that in war, sometimes the darkest enemy is not the one across the battlefield, but the one that grows inside your own heart. When the guns fell silent in that Missouri field in October 1864, it seemed like the story of William T. Bloody Bill Anderson had finally come to an end. The man who had terrified soldiers and civilians alike was gone, shot down, buried, and forgotten. Or at least that's what people hoped. But legends have a strange way of surviving, and sometimes death is only the beginning. Word of Anderson's death spread like wildfire across Missouri. Union soldiers celebrated. They posed for photographs beside his corpse. Newspapers ran headlines calling it justice at last. But for many in the South, especially those who had lost everything to the war, His death was not justice. It was martyrdom. They whispered that Anderson had died fighting for the South, for freedom, for revenge. His story twisted into myth, the story of a fearless rebel who refused to surrender even when surrounded. And as the smoke of war cleared, young men began to repeat his name with awe. To them, Bloody Bill wasn't a monster. He was a symbol. Among those young men was one who had once ridden under Anderson's command, a quiet, sharp-eyed guerrilla named Jesse James. Jesse was only a teenager when he joined the bushwhackers, but under Anderson, he learned everything about violence, ambush, and survival. He saw how fear could be used as a weapon. He watched Anderson lead with calm brutality, no hesitation, no remorse. And when the war ended, Jesse didn't put away his gun. He carried Anderson's lessons into a new kind of war, a personal one. The Civil War had destroyed Missouri. Farms were burned. Families were gone. And thousands of young men returned home with nothing but rage in their hearts. For many of them, peace felt strange. There was no glory in rebuilding fences or plowing fields. They had been soldiers, outlaws, avengers, and now they were told to be quiet, to forget. But men like Jesse James couldn't forget. They turned to robbery, banks, trains, stagecoaches, striking at the same kind of authority they had fought during the war. To the public, they were criminals. But to some, they were heroes, men standing up to a corrupt government. Much like Anderson once had, and in every whispered story about these new outlaws, Anderson's ghost lingered. Bloody Bill had taught them that fear was power, that violence could make a man famous, even immortal. Jesse James and his brother Frank both admired him. They remembered the way he rode into battle without hesitation. They remembered his black flag, the promise of no surrender. And when Jesse formed his own gang, that same spirit rode with him. The newspapers would later call them the James Younger Gang. But in the hearts of their followers, they were carrying on something older, the ruthless creed of Bloody Bill Anderson. Meanwhile, Anderson's legend grew larger with every passing year. Stories of his life and his death spread across the frontier, changing a little each time they were told. In some versions, he was a heroic freedom fighter, standing up to Union tyranny. In others, he was the devil himself, a man who killed for the pleasure of it. The truth lay somewhere in between, buried under layers of myth and blood. Historians would later try to piece together the man behind the myth. They discovered he was only 24 years old when he died, barely more than a boy. He'd never led an army, never held rank, never followed orders. Yet his name became as feared as any general's. He wasn't fighting for the Confederacy anymore. He was fighting for something far more personal, revenge, pain, and chaos. And that made him more dangerous than any army. As the 1870s dawned, the Wild West began to rise. New legends took shape: Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy, Jesse James. All of them carried a spark of that same rebellion Anderson had ignited. They wore guns like badges, lived outside the law, and made their own rules. And in the dark corners of their stories, you could still see the shadow of the man who came before them, the man who proved that fear could make you famous. But not everyone remembered him with pride. To many, he was a warning, a reminder of how easily war can twist a human soul. Parents told their children about him like a ghost story. Be careful, or Bloody Bill will come for you. Even Union veterans, hardened by years of battle, refused to speak his name aloud. It was said that some who fought at Centralia woke in the night, dreaming of his cold eyes staring down a smoking pistol. The war had ended, but the trauma he left behind did not. In Missouri, there were still scars, both on the land and in people's hearts. Decades later, Anderson's grave in Richmond, Missouri, became a curiosity. Travelers came to see where the infamous bushwhacker had been buried. Some claimed his ghost still haunted the fields where he fell. Others swore that the wind, whistling through the grass, sounded like the distant thunder of hooves, as if Bloody Bill was still riding through the trees. No one really knew what was true anymore. And maybe that was the point, because every great legend, every monster, every hero, lives on through the stories people tell. And in the case of Bloody Bill Anderson, those stories were drenched in both fear and fascination. In the end, his legacy was neither victory nor honor. It was influence, a dark inspiration passed down to the men who would shape the violent birth of the American West. He taught them that a man with nothing left to lose could still carve his name into history, even if he had to use blood to do it. And so, long after his death, the world remembered him not as the man he was, but as the myth he became, a ghostly rider draped in black, whose revenge echoed through generations, from the Civil War battlefields to the outlaw trails of the Wild West. Long before the name Bloody Bill Anderson struck fear across Missouri, there was just William, a quiet boy who loved horses, open fields, and the endless skies of Kentucky. He wasn't born a killer. He wasn't raised to hate. He was just a farm boy in a world that was about to fall apart. William T. Anderson came into the world around 1840, the son of William C. Anderson and Martha Anderson. The Andersons were an ordinary frontier family, hardworking, poor, but proud. They believed in honesty, in family, and in doing what needed to be done to survive. William's father traded horses, traveling dusty roads from one small town to another. He taught his son how to ride, how to shoot, and how to work with his hands. He taught him that a man's word was everything. Neighbors said William was quiet, polite but distant, serious even as a child. He wasn't loud or reckless like other boys. He preferred the calm rhythm of riding, the feeling of freedom that came from open land. He was a good son, a loyal brother, and, as far as anyone could tell, a kind boy. The monster he would become was nowhere in sight, but the frontier was a hard place to grow up. Missouri was a land divided long before the Civil War ever began. Tension hung in the air like a storm cloud. Every argument about politics, slavery, or state rights could turn into gunfire. William grew up watching this chaos, the way anger spread faster than wildfire, the way men could kill each other over a flag or a word. It was a violent education. And whether he realized it or not, that world was shaping him, teaching him that power came not from peace, but from fear. When the Anderson family moved to Huntsville, Missouri, life didn't get easier. They were strangers in a place already full of conflict. Still, they worked hard, built their farm, and tried to stay out of politics. But the war didn't care about staying neutral. It came for everyone. In 1861, when the Civil War broke out, Missouri became a living battlefield, a place where neighbor fought neighbor, and no one was safe from suspicion. Families were split down the middle. Unionists and Confederates lived on the same street, and one wrong word could get a man killed. For William, that moment came sooner than expected. His father, the man who had taught him everything, was murdered. Accounts differ on who pulled the trigger. Some said it was a personal dispute. Others said it was a Union sympathizer who saw Anderson as a traitor. But in the end, it didn't matter. William found the man he believed was responsible and killed him. It was the first time he crossed that line, the line between anger and blood, and once he crossed it, he would never go back. That act of vengeance changed him. He began to see the world not as good or evil, but as us versus them. He joined the Confederate guerrillas, not out of loyalty but out of rage. He wanted to make the North feel what he felt: loss, pain, and fear. At first, he followed William Quantrill, the infamous guerrilla leader. Quantrill's men lived like shadows, striking from the woods, killing and disappearing. They called themselves bushwhackers, and they gave no mercy. For Anderson, it was the perfect place to bury his grief, but even among killers, Anderson stood out. He was calm when others were wild, focused when others were chaotic. He didn't kill for the thrill of it, at least not at first. He killed because it was the only way he knew to balance the scales, and then came the event that broke what little humanity he had left: the collapse of the Kansas City Women's Prison in 1863. The prison had been holding several women accused of helping Confederate guerrillas, including Anderson's sisters. The building was old, unstable, and overcrowded. And one day, without warning, the walls gave way. The structure collapsed, killing and injuring those inside. One of the dead was Anderson's sister. Another was crippled for life. To the Union soldiers, it was an accident. To Anderson, it was murder. From that day forward, he stopped being William Anderson, the man. He became Bloody Bill, the Avenger. It's easy to call him evil. And yes, his actions were monstrous. But understanding him means looking into that fire of grief and anger that consumed so many during that time. He lost his father. He lost his sisters. He lost his home. And somewhere in that storm of pain, he lost himself. His rage gave him purpose. And that purpose turned him into something the world would never forget. Some historians believe Anderson was mentally broken, a man suffering from trauma, paranoia, and guilt. Others think he simply surrendered to hatred, letting it drive him like a horse that had gone wild. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: William Anderson was not born a monster. The war made him one. If the Civil War had ended before his father's death, before his sisters were buried under those ruins, perhaps he would have grown old on that Missouri farm. A husband, a father, a man of peace, but fate chose differently. Instead, he became a symbol of what war does to the human soul, and how it can twist a man until he no longer recognizes himself. He became proof that even ordinary people can be turned into devils, when pain and vengeance are all they have left to live for. When people remember Bloody Bill Anderson, they often think of the killer, the black flag, the massacres, the blood. But behind all that was a boy who once just wanted to ride horses and live free. A boy who never imagined that the world would turn him into a nightmare. And that's the tragedy of his story. Not just that he killed so many, but that war killed him first, long before that bullet ever did. Fear. That was Bloody Bill Anderson's real weapon. Not his pistols. Not his black flag. Fear, cold, creeping, unstoppable. That's what made men surrender before the first shot was fired. By 1864, his name alone could silence a room. Farmers whispered it at night. Soldiers flinched when they heard it. And mothers in Missouri warned their children, "Be good, or Bloody Bill will come for you." Anderson had learned something no army ever could. That fear was worth more than bullets. A bullet kills one man, but fear can destroy an entire town. Every time he rode through Missouri, he didn't just leave bodies behind. He left stories. And those stories grew faster than any wildfire. He and his men, a pack of ruthless bushwhackers, rode under a black flag. It wasn't the Confederate flag or the Union banner. It meant one thing: no mercy. It was their promise and their warning. If that black flag appeared on the horizon, you didn't run. You prayed. They moved like shadows through the hills and forests, riding hard on lean horses, their pistols gleaming in the sunlight. They carried six-shooters, not muskets. They didn't fight in lines or follow orders. They struck from nowhere and vanished into the trees. They were ghosts with guns, and Anderson was their general of fear. Every raid was carefully planned. He didn't waste time with long speeches or strategies. He rode fast, struck hard, and made sure the message was clear: that the Union Army could not protect anyone. A patrol disappeared near Lexington. That was Anderson. A supply train robbed, its crew found dead by the tracks. Anderson. A Union sympathizer found hanging from a tree at dawn. Anderson again. Even when he wasn't there, they blamed him. His legend had become larger than the man himself. Anderson understood the power of image. He made sure people saw what he wanted them to see. He wore his black hair long, almost wild. He dressed in stolen Union uniforms, sometimes even riding under captured flags to confuse the enemy. When his men entered a town, they fired their guns into the air and shouted his name. It wasn't just victory they wanted, it was panic. He wanted his enemies to tremble before they even saw him. Fear spread faster than gunfire. Union soldiers began refusing patrols through certain regions. Civilians packed up and fled from entire counties. Some historians say Anderson controlled more of Missouri through terror than any general did through occupation, and that's what made him truly dangerous. He didn't need an army. He was an idea, a whisper in the dark. He was the boogeyman of the Civil War, but fear cuts both ways. And soon, it began to consume even those who followed him. Anderson's men lived by his code: no mercy, no surrender. But they were still human. They saw what they were doing. They watched towns burn, heard the screams, and began to wonder if they were still fighting for a cause or just feeding their leader's fury. Some broke away. Some were killed trying to leave. Others stayed, not out of loyalty, but because they feared Anderson more than the Union. He had become not just a leader, but a legend no one could escape. One of his closest riders, Archie Clement, worshipped him like a brother. He copied Anderson's every move: his long hair, his reckless charges, even his cruelty. Clement would later become one of the most feared post-war outlaws in Missouri, and when people asked where he'd learned such savagery, he would simply smile and say, From Bloody Bill. Anderson's power didn't come from numbers or weapons. It came from his legend. Even Union generals talked about him in hushed tones. One called him a beast with a man's face. Another said, killing him would save more lives than winning a battle. That's when the Union Army changed its tactics. They weren't going to fight Anderson's men like soldiers. They were going to hunt them like animals. Orders were clear. No prisoners. No negotiation. If you find Anderson, kill him. The hunter had become the hunted, but even as the walls closed in, Anderson didn't slow down. If anything, he grew bolder. He started attacking larger groups, daring the Union to face him. He was living on adrenaline and anger, a man who had lost everything and was now fueled only by destruction. Some said he believed he couldn't die. Others said he wanted to. Either way, he was riding faster toward his own doom, dragging dozens of men with him down that same bloody road. By late 1864, Missouri was burning. The war was almost over, but Anderson refused to quit. He wasn't fighting for victory anymore. He was fighting because it was all he knew, and everywhere he went, fear followed like a shadow. But even fear has limits. And as Anderson's legend reached its peak, his power began to turn against him. The same whispers that once protected him now drew the eyes of every Union officer in the state. They wanted his head, and nothing else would do. The man who had ruled Missouri through fear was about to learn that there's one thing even fear can't stop. Fate. Because just weeks after the Centralia Massacre, a new name entered Anderson's story. A man who would finally end it. Major Samuel P. Cox, the soldier who would hunt Bloody Bill to his final breath. And in the fields near Orick, Missouri, the legend of Bloody Bill Anderson would finally meet its fire and end in silence. It was the dawn of October 26, 1864. The sun rose weakly over the Missouri countryside, painting the horizon in golden gray. The air was still, too still, and in that silence rode a man who believed himself untouchable. His name, whispered across every burned town and broken road, was Bloody Bill Anderson. He had cheated death too many times to count. He'd outrun soldiers, survived ambushes, and stared down hundreds of rifles. His men said he could never die, that bullets curved away from him, that he had made a pact with the devil himself. But even the devil collects his debts. Anderson's band, about 80 bushwhackers, was on the move again. They rode through Ray County, their horses covered in stolen saddles, their saddlebags heavy with loot. They'd been raiding for days, cutting through Union supply lines, setting farms ablaze, leaving nothing but ashes behind. The war was ending, but Anderson didn't care. He wasn't fighting for the South anymore, or for any cause. He fought because he didn't know how to stop. That morning, as they rode near the small town of Orick, Missouri, the men were in high spirits. They had whiskey. They had gold. And they believed no one could touch them. Anderson himself was laughing, something he rarely did, when the first crack of rifle fire shattered the calm. Bullets hissed through the air like angry bees. One horse went down, then another. Men shouted, drawing their pistols, spinning in confusion. The woods ahead erupted in smoke and fire. It was an ambush. Waiting for them in those trees was Major Samuel P. Cox, a Union officer who had spent weeks tracking Anderson's every move. Cox's scouts had learned Anderson's route, and that morning they set the perfect trap. His men lay hidden behind a ridge, rifles steady, nerves cold as stone. When Anderson's band appeared on the road below, Cox gave the order, and the forest roared. Anderson wheeled his horse around, shouting for his men to fight back. He had faced ambushes before. He knew panic killed faster than bullets. He charged forward, his black hair streaming behind him, his pistols flashing in both hands. He looked like death itself, fearless, unbroken, unstoppable. But this time, death was waiting for him. A bullet struck his horse, sending the animal crashing to the ground. Anderson hit the dirt hard but rolled quickly, firing back. Union soldiers advanced through the smoke, their gunfire relentless. He tried to mount another horse, shouting, ordering his men to charge. But the trap was too tight. His riders were falling all around him. And then, through the chaos, came the shot that ended everything. A single bullet, clean, sharp, and final, struck Anderson in the head, just above the eye. He fell instantly, his pistols dropping from his hands, his body crumpling into the mud. For a moment, the gunfire kept going. But soon, one by one, the shots fell silent. Smoke drifted through the trees, and where the Devil of Missouri had stood, there was only a body. Major Cox's men advanced cautiously. They had heard too many stories, that Anderson could rise again, that he couldn't be killed by mortal men. But when they reached him, there was no doubt. The blood, the wound, the empty eyes, it was over. Bloody Bill Anderson was dead. He was only 24 years old. They searched his body. On him, they found $300 in gold, a silver watch, and a necklace made from Union soldiers' scalps, proof of his horror and his madness. His revolvers were still loaded, the grips carved with his initials, and the black flag, his symbol of no mercy, was folded inside his coat. For Major Cox, the hunt was finished. For Missouri, the nightmare had finally ended. They carried the body to Richmond, Missouri, and laid it out in the town square. Crowds gathered to see it, the face that had haunted them for years. Some spat on him. Some prayed over him. Others just stared in disbelief. He didn't look like a monster anymore. He looked young, almost peaceful, like the farm boy he once had been before the war turned him into something else. A local photographer was called in to take pictures. The black and white image captured the stillness of death. His long hair, his lifeless eyes, his pistol belt still fastened at his side. That photograph would spread across the country, printed in newspapers and pasted on tavern walls. It was proof that even the darkest legends bleed. But for every person who rejoiced, there were others who mourned. To some, he was a hero who died fighting a corrupt Union army. To others, he was a butcher who had finally met justice. In truth, he was neither. He was simply a man broken by war, a man who became what the world around him demanded, a killer, a symbol, and finally, a ghost. They buried him in an unmarked grave near Richmond. No prayers, no headstone, just a mound of earth to cover the most feared name in Missouri. But legends don't stay buried. Within weeks, stories began to spread that Anderson hadn't really died, that it was another man's body, that he'd escaped and was still riding through the night with his black flag flying. People wanted to believe it. Because in a strange way, the world without Bloody Bill Anderson felt just as frightening as the world with him. And so, in that quiet Missouri field, the story of Bloody Bill Anderson ended. But the legend of the Devil of Missouri had only begun. A boy who became a monster who became a myth, and a myth that would echo across the generations, in every outlaw, every rebel, every man who believed fear could make him free. When the echo of gunfire faded in that Missouri field, it seemed the war itself had taken a deep breath. Bloody Bill Anderson, the man who had ruled the borderlands through fear, was finally dead. But in truth, his death was just the beginning of another kind of war. A war over memory, myth, and what his name would mean for generations to come. The news spread fast. By the next morning, every town in Missouri was buzzing with rumors. Some said Anderson had been shot through the eye. Others said his head had been blown apart by cannon fire. No one agreed on the details, but everyone agreed on one thing. Bloody Bill was gone. Union soldiers celebrated. They drank, sang, and fired shots into the air. To them it was justice, the end of a nightmare. The newspapers called him the Butcher of Centralia and the Devil of Missouri. The Richmond Conservative, a local paper, printed the words plainly, "The reign of terror is over. Anderson is dead. May the earth rest easy on his grave." But not everyone felt relief. In the burned-out farmlands of Missouri, among the families who had lost everything to Union raids, his death felt like revenge, not justice. They didn't see a monster. They saw a man who had fought back, a man who had made the North pay in blood for every insult, every burning home, every dead son. To them, Bloody Bill Anderson wasn't the devil. He was a martyr, a symbol of Southern defiance. At night, old men sat by their fires, telling stories about the time Anderson rode through their town, how he faced death without fear, how he never surrendered. And over time, the truth began to fade, replaced by myth. In those stories, the massacres became battles. The killings became victories, and the devil became a hero. Meanwhile, the men who had once ridden beside him scattered across the country. Some went home, trying to live quiet lives. Others couldn't let go of the chaos, the adrenaline, the sense of power that came from living without rules. Among them was a young rider who had once looked up to Anderson like a legend. Jesse James. Jesse had seen Anderson's raids firsthand. He had learned from him not just how to fight, but how to control people through fear and reputation. He remembered how Anderson turned every act of violence into a story, how he made his name bigger than any army, and Jesse took that lesson with him into the years after the war. When he and his brother Frank James began robbing banks and trains, they used the same tactics: swift attacks, fearless escapes, and the power of myth. People whispered about them just as they had whispered about Anderson. They called Jesse the new Bloody Bill, and in some ways, they were right. Anderson's spirit had lived on, not in body, but in the code of the outlaw. The Civil War had ended, but Missouri never truly found peace. The land was scarred, the people bitter, and the law weak. Men like Anderson had shown that a gun could make its own justice. And now others followed that path. The outlaw era had begun, an age of guns, gangs, and revenge. But as the years passed, Anderson's name changed shape again. To some, he remained a villain, a killer who had murdered unarmed men and terrorized civilians. To others, he was a tragic figure, a man twisted by war, a victim of circumstances that no human could survive untouched. Historians debated his motives for decades. Was he insane? Was he evil? Or was he just a young man broken by loss and turned loose in a world without rules? There was no clear answer, and maybe that's why his story never truly died, because it sat in that gray space between right and wrong, hero and villain, man and monster. Even his grave became a mystery. For years, no one could say for sure where he was buried. Some claimed his body had been moved. Others swore he had faked his death and escaped to Texas. People wanted to believe the devil had survived, that he was still out there, riding under the moonlight, his black flag fluttering in the wind. In a strange way, the people who feared him most were the same ones who kept his story alive. By the late 1800s, Bloody Bill Anderson had become part of American folklore. His name appeared in dime novels, cheap paperbacks that romanticized the Wild West. Writers turned him into a tragic anti-hero, a wronged soldier pushed too far. And every generation found something new in his story. For some, he was a lesson about vengeance. For others, a warning about what war does to the human soul. But for all the storytelling and myth-making, one thing never changed. The truth that fear made him powerful, and that fear still lived on in the places he once haunted. Even today, if you walk the quiet fields near Oric or Centralia, locals will tell you the air feels heavy there. That sometimes, when the wind moves just right, you can hear distant gunfire, hooves pounding across the hills, and the faint echo of a man shouting orders to his riders. Maybe it's just the wind, or maybe some ghosts never rest. The Civil War created many heroes, many villains, and many ghosts, but none were quite like Bloody Bill Anderson, a man whose life was consumed by revenge, whose legend was built on fear, and whose death could not stop the stories people told about him. He was a man who lost everything and made the world lose its innocence in return. Time has a way of softening the sharpest edges. Wars end, bodies are buried, and the world moves on. But not every ghost fades with the years. Some stories keep riding through generations, through history books, through whispers told by firelight. And one of those stories is the legend of William T. Bloody Bill Anderson. More than 160 years have passed since the gunfire died in Missouri. The farms he once burned are now fields of corn and wheat. The railroads he raided carry tourists, not soldiers. And yet, his name still lingers in the soil, a dark echo of the madness that once ruled those hills. Because Anderson wasn't just a man, he was a reflection of what war does to the human heart. Historians still argue over who he truly was. Some call him a murderer, a cold-blooded psychopath who used the Civil War as an excuse for slaughter. Others see him as a victim, a man broken by loss, by grief, by injustice. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. He wasn't born evil. He was made that way, forged in the fire of a nation tearing itself apart. Every war creates monsters, but it doesn't start that way. It starts with ideals, pride, loyalty, the promise of freedom. And then, slowly, the killing begins to make sense. The lines blur. The cause becomes personal. And before long you forget why you ever started fighting at all. That's what happened to Bloody Bill Anderson. He began as a son defending his family. He ended as a man who no longer knew what he was defending, only that he couldn't stop fighting. When people talk about him now, they see two versions: the monster, who ordered men to be lined up and shot, who burned towns to ash, who wore the scalps of his enemies like trophies, and the man, who lost his father, who buried his sisters, who lived in a world that had already taken everything from him. Both are true. And that's what makes his story so haunting. Because if war could twist him, a quiet farm boy from Kentucky, what could it do to any of us? In his short, violent life, Anderson became a mirror of America's own darkness. He showed how quickly humans can justify horror when they believe they've been wronged. He showed how revenge can feel like justice until it consumes everything else. And he showed how the line between hero and villain can disappear completely when blood is spilled in the name of something righteous. But even in the blood, there's a lesson, one that history still whispers to those willing to listen. Fear can rule a land. Violence can make you famous, but neither can bring peace. And the men who live by those things never live long. Today, if you walk through Centralia, Missouri, you'll find a small memorial marking the massacre, a stone carved with names of the men who died there. The town is peaceful now. Children play near the railroad tracks where soldiers once fell, but locals say that sometimes, on quiet autumn mornings, you can still hear the faint rumble of hooves, the sound of riders passing through the mist. And if you listen closely, you might catch a voice shouting orders, low, cold, commanding. Maybe it's just the wind. Or maybe it's the memory of the man who made Missouri tremble. History never really buries men like Bloody Bill Anderson. It studies them. It argues over them. It tries to understand what they mean. Because the truth is, his story isn't just about one man. It's about all of us. It's about what happens when anger replaces empathy, when vengeance replaces purpose. When the human heart becomes a battlefield of its own. Anderson's legacy didn't end in that muddy Missouri field. It lived on in every outlaw who believed the gun could bring justice. It lived on in Jesse James, in the legends of the Wild West, in every dark tale of rebellion that America has ever loved. Because deep down, people are fascinated by those who break the rules, even when they know it leads to ruin. We remember them not because they were right, but because they remind us of the darkness we all try to hide. In the end, William T. Anderson left behind no monument, no statue, no songs of glory, only stories. Some told in hate, some told in awe, and all of them written in blood. But maybe that's what makes his story matter. Not the fear he created, but the warning it carries. That vengeance is a fire you can't control. That war doesn't end when the fighting stops. And that sometimes the scariest devils in history were once just ordinary men who lost too much to ever come back. So when you hear his name, Bloody Bill Anderson, remember the story, but also the lesson. Because in the end, his greatest legacy isn't the terror he caused. It's the truth he revealed. That hatred can make you powerful, but it will never make you free. He was born a man, died a legend, and became a warning carved into the heart of history.